Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. We're heading into the weekend, so it's time to let loose and let the inner outlaw out. And so we're going to be doing a tasting of Yellow Rose Distilling Outlaw Bourbon Whiskey. Now this is a 100% corn whiskey. And so you're saying, okay, why are they calling it bourbon and not calling it corn whiskey? And there is a reason. And I'm going to jump into that reason while we're getting ready to do a tasting of this whiskey. I also wanted to note, if you want some listening material for this weekend, check out the podcast Distillers Talk with Alan Bishop and Christy Atkinson. They had me on and I unload some of the information that I researched and some of my techniques for doing research and the rest for this Tennessee whiskey history book. And one of the things we talk about during that interview is we talk about how it would be interesting to go back, now that we know how they made whiskey in Tennessee before the Civil War and just after the Civil War, if a distiller could come out and actually make something like that again. And then I started playing things around in my mind, and I thought, I don't know if you technically could now, because Tennessee kind of put itself in the corner by making the word Tennessee and whiskey together, or Tennessee sour mash whiskey together, have a very specific and tough criteria. And one of the criteria is that that whiskey needs to be aged in a charred oak barrel. Now, it can be aged in a charred oak barrel for seconds, but it has to be aged in a charred oak barrel, which for seconds, it's probably not going to change much in terms of flavor impact, but it's kind of wasteful of a barrel to just toss it aside after you've had liquid in it for a period of a couple of seconds. And you couldn't really reuse it because now you're using used cooperage, even though it would have basically the same performance likely of a brand new charred oak barrel. So it's tough. It has painted them into a corner where they can't make whiskey the way that potentially Jack Daniel made it, Uncle Nearest made it, so on and so forth, going back, and all those pre-Civil War distillers as well, because the way they were making the whiskey, they would make a sour mash whiskey, possibly on a log still, and they would ferment for 5 days, and they would do natural fermentations to make that sour mash whiskey. And while they could do the longer fermentations and try to do the wild yeast collection on that to try to get the whiskey to start itself off of that little bit of sour mash that you tossed in as well, where it gets to be a problem is this aging part. Because now what do? We can't really, their idea back then was, we're going to run it through sugar maple charcoal, and that is going to purify the spirit, and it doesn't need a barrel. And so if you then decide to put it into used cooperage and try to make whiskey out of it, well, you can't make Tennessee whiskey in a used barrel. So they've locked themselves off from that. But I may have a semi-solution, and Yellow Rose actually brought it to me when I started thinking about, this is a 100% corn whiskey, but it's called bourbon. So how do they get away with that? Why would you just not call this corn whiskey, or why wouldn't you call something like mellow corn bourbon? Because it's, hey, that's made in Kentucky, right? Well, it's because of the rules of bourbon versus corn whiskey. Or corn whiskey has its own set of rules, and basically it needs to be made of 80% corn instead of 51% corn. So that's one of the main differences. Well, we got 100% corn here, right? And you may have 80% corn, you may have 88% corn in a whiskey that was made in Tennessee way back when. I doubt they would have done 100% corn because they did not want anything added to the mix. So adding enzymes was not going to be something that would have been acceptable to a distiller of that time period if they could get their hands on an enzyme. So they were going to use probably at least 12% malted barley in there to be able to get that conversion going on. So as I'm thinking about this, I had to dig in and go, okay, why would this be called bourbon? Mellow corn is not, because mellow corn is aged for 4 years. This is aged for just over a year. This is aged in small barrels. Mellow corn is aged in large barrels. But here's the difference. Because mellow corn is actually aged in used cooperage, it cannot be called bourbon because that would break the rules of bourbon. Whereas this is put into new, fresh, charred oak barrels. They're smaller, doesn't matter. Aged a year, doesn't matter. They're not calling it straight bourbon. So if they're not calling it straight bourbon, then you know, we can get down here and have this 1 year age statement on this whiskey. Balcones Baby Blue, same kind of a scenario with that one. Now that one is not called it. That is called a corn whiskey. So they are likely using aged barrels for that. I haven't checked that to make sure. It's no hold me to that. But that would really explain to me how in Texas you could make a whiskey that isn't going to get overwhelmed by the char in the heat in that way. And it actually amazes me that this can go for 2 years in the small, or for a year in the small barrel and not get overly overwhelmed or end up tasting just like a barrel. And as I do the tasting on this, we're going to find out it doesn't just taste like a barrel. But my solution, I think, and of course, this is going to be up to the TTB. This is, you know, this skirts around the law, I think, in Tennessee, is that if they wanted to make a whiskey that is made like they made it in the old days, where, let's say they can do the fermentation, they can do all the other stuff, and then they get the charcoal mellowing done. Now they got to put it in a barrel. Well, they can put it in an unaged barrel or in used cooperage and call it, and as long as it's 80% corn, they could call it corn whiskey. So they would call it Tennessee Sour Mash Corn Whiskey. And maybe they could use that word corn to differentiate. That's an interesting question, and I pose that to all Tennessee distillers and say, what do you think? Is that something that's possible or not possible? It would be very interesting to know, and it'd probably have to be, I mean, it's interesting because it's a Tennessee state law, so you wouldn't really have to pass it through the TTB likely, but instead would have to pass it through the state of Tennessee and say, is this something we're going to allow? Because you're actually adding an extra word to this name, and is that enough to allow us to make whiskey instead of making Tennessee whiskey, yet still put the word Tennessee on it there? I don't know. It's the crazy stuff that runs through my brain, but it's so funny that I went to a Texas whiskey to potentially get an answer to this quandary. Now this whiskey, I've done a tasting on this whiskey before. You may notice I've had this whiskey for quite some time, and it doesn't look like I've had too much out of it. Well, that's true. And you know why? Because I love this bottle, and it has been up on my shelf. So it's like I have to get the stepladder out. Yes, me, even at 6'6", has to get on a stepladder to get to the top of my cabinets and my 9-foot ceiling. So, but I mean, I love the little coin on the top of the bottle is really cool. The ribbing and heavy base there at the bottom. It's just a very elegant looking bottle, and it looks better when it's full than it does once you start getting liquid out of it, because my other bottle that I have is down to here, and you can't read Yellow Rose on it because it's white on clear, and so you can't really see it as well. So that is my pretzel logic for today on that particular thing. So this is 46% ABV. It's 100% corn, aged for just over a year in small barrels. And he actually, they put the batch number on here. It's L21-7, and bottle number on there as well. And they also note here that that they're using pot stills, which is great. because this gives us another opportunity to get away from the column stills and jump in and taste something that may have retained some of those heavier oils and really, you know, has gone through the reflux process and may give us a different character. So the first thing that I notice when I nose this whiskey is how sweet it is. I mean, and you would say, okay, I get that. It's 100% corn. It probably smells like a popcorn bowl at the movie theater with extra butter on top. It does not. That's what's surprising about this. It is very sweet on the nose, but it is not coming at me at all with corn. What it's coming at me with is vanilla and marshmallows, almost like a slightly smoky marshmallow coming through on there. And I even got a little cola note, so a little bit of cherry note coming in there along with that cooperage note. And the one that really threw me, because I don't get this on the nose a whole lot, but it's definitely here. And I don't know that it seems like something that would blend with these other scents, but it is like a cinnamon red hot note. And it even in some ways reminds me of those little Valentine's candies that you get. It's got that kind of a sweetness to it. And that's all coming through the nose. So it's a really, really interesting whiskey. And that there's that much personality in this whiskey on the nose with such a short age is really, I think, a testament to making pot stilled whiskey rather than making it through a column still. Cheers. The surprising thing about this whiskey is how not sweet it is on the palate. You get a corn note, you get the buttered popcorn on the finish, and it just lays there, and it is prominent. But there's herbally notes in this. So it makes me wonder about the type of corn that they're using, or how he's working with reflux, whatever it is, or maybe the barrels that they're putting them in, and how they're charring those barrels. I don't know what it is. There's a little bit of it's a pleasant taste. Towards the end, you get a little bitterness, and I get it sort of on the back of the palate coming from the barrel, and it's probably going to be different batch to batch, I would imagine. But it's really the only negative I have in this, and it's so slight and insignificant. It actually works along with that kind of dry, herbally kind of a note that I'm getting on the palate. And it's interesting that it's enough of a dry, herbally note that it counteracts that buttery popcorn, and you don't tend to focus on it quite as much. A little vanilla comes through to the finish as well. But I mean, there's a lot of activity going on for a whiskey that's only been aged for a little over a year. And of course, you're going to put it in a smaller barrel, and you're going to have it in the Houston heat and humidity. You know, that's going to create its own perils, we could say. But it actually has worked, and that's what really impresses me about this particular whiskey. The sad part is, I'll probably want to put it back on the top shelf again so that I don't touch it. But if I was going to serve up a corn whiskey to someone, and it's called bourbon because it has actually been aged in new cooperage, new charred oak barrels. That's the main difference. So it's 100% corn, enzymes used to be able, because they didn't use any malted barley in it. But it is something that, like I say, because it has been put into new charred oak barrels, that allows it to use the word bourbon. I hope you enjoyed this. I don't know, have you had Yellow Rose before? Give me your thoughts below on anything. It's not in our bracketology. Keep your eye on bracketology. That runs all weekend. That goes all the way to the end of the month. Every day, 2 different whiskeys are going to be posted up there for you to taste and experience. So I hope you enjoy those as they come up, and keep on voting along. It's a tough one today, the Uncle Nearest and Nelson's Greenbrier. Breaks my heart that one of them potentially has to go because both of them are what drew me into an interest in the lost history of Tennessee whiskey. So it'll be interesting to see who comes out on top. Usually, though, once I get to the end of the round, whichever matchup gets the highest votes and it's close, I will sometimes kick out a low scorer and bring that into the competition, back into the competition. I try not to do more than 2 of those out of the first round, and then I don't do that the rest of the way through. So maybe both will make it through, because they are getting a ton of votes right now either way. But keep voting, and let's find out what the People's Choice Whiskey of the Year is for 2024. And until next time, cheers and Slainte.